For 300,000 years, we were not alone. Other humans walked this earth. They built fires, they buried their dead, they raised children, made tools, and looked up at the same stars we do. And then, in a span of time that is barely a blink on the geological clock, every single one of them disappeared, every species except us. This isn't the story of one extinction, it's the story of at least three, and the strangest part isn't how they died, it's how close some of them came to surviving, and how much of them is still quietly inside you. Here's something most people never learn in school. Human used to mean more than one thing. 200,000 years ago, if you were standing in Europe, you might have crossed paths with a Neanderthal, stockier than us, heavy-browed, expert toolmakers who had already been thriving on that continent for over 100,000 years before modern humans ever arrived. Travel east into Siberia and Central Asia, and you'd have found a population so mysterious that scientists didn't even know it existed until 2010. We call them the Denisovans, and we know almost nothing about what they looked like, because nearly everything we know about them comes from a handful of bone fragments and teeth. And if you kept traveling all the way to a small island in Indonesia, you'd have found something even stranger, a population of humans standing barely 3.5 feet tall, hunting pygmy elephants with stone tools, isolated on an island for hundreds of thousands of years. Scientists nickname them hobbits, three different kinds of human, three different corners of the world, and all three of them gone, vanished within roughly the same slice of prehistory that Homo sapiens spread out of Africa and across the globe. That timing is not a coincidence, and figuring out exactly what happened is one of the strangest detective stories in all of science, one that's still being rewritten today, as new fossils, new climate data, and new genetic techniques keep changing the answer. Let's start with the case we understand best. Neanderthals weren't primitive brutes. That image is outdated. They controlled fire, treated wounds, made jewelry, and may have created cave art. They hunted large, dangerous animals at close range, cared for injured members of their group well enough that some individuals survived for years with disabilities that should have been fatal, and adapted to environments ranging from freezing tundra to Mediterranean coastline. For over 300,000 years, they were one of the most successful human species on the planet, thriving through multiple ice ages across Europe and Western Asia. Then, sometime around 40,000 years ago, they were gone. For decades, scientists assumed a single dramatic cause, maybe a volcanic winter, maybe outright violence from incoming modern humans. But newer research paints a slower, more complicated picture. Careful redating of dozens of archaeological sites across Europe, using improved methods to strip out modern contamination from ancient bone and charcoal samples, suggests Neanderthals didn't disappear all at once. They vanished in a patchwork, surviving in some regions for thousands of years longer than in others, dying out at different times in different valleys and coastlines, from the Black Sea to the Atlantic. The most likely story isn't a single knockout blow, it's death by 1,000 disadvantages. Neanderthal groups were small and scattered, which made them vulnerable to the ordinary genetic problems of small populations. Difficulty finding mates, gradual inbreeding, unstable birth and death rates that could tip a fragile population into decline. Modern humans arriving in the same territory added pressure, competing for the same game, the same caves, the same resources. But recent research also points to something subtler, a difference in social networks. Modern human groups may have stayed more connected to each other across long distances, trading, mixing, and sharing knowledge and resources across dozens of communities. Neanderthal groups, by contrast, appear to have stayed more isolated and local, which meant that when local conditions turned bad, there was no wider network to fall back on. And then there's the strangest twist of all. We didn't just replace the Neanderthals, we absorbed them. When modern humans and Neanderthals encountered each other, they had children. Today, nearly everyone with ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa carries a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA in their genome, inherited from encounters that happened tens of thousands of years ago. Some researchers now argue that repeated small-scale interbreeding, Generation after generation may have gradually diluted the Neanderthal gene pool into the modern human one until there was no longer a genetically distinct Neanderthal population left to disappear. Under this theory, Neanderthals didn't lose a war, they were slowly, quietly dissolved into us. In a strange sense, Neanderthals may not have died out completely, they were folded into us. But if Neanderthals are the best documented mystery, the next case is almost the opposite, a species we can barely picture at all. In 2008, in a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, researchers pulled a tiny fragment of bone from the dirt, a piece of a child's pinky finger. It seemed unremarkable. It wasn't. When scientists sequenced the DNA from that fragment in 2010, they found something that didn't match any known human species, not us, not Neanderthals, something else entirely, a population that had branched off from our shared family tree hundreds of thousands of years earlier and then vanished from the fossil record almost completely. Scientists named them Denisovans after the cave. And here's what makes them one of the strangest chapters in human history. We have built an entire picture of this population out of almost nothing: a finger bone, a handful of teeth, a fragment of skull, a jawbone dredged up from the seafloor near Taiwan, a molar found in a cave in Laos. That's essentially the entire physical evidence for an entire branch of humanity that may have ranged across a huge stretch of Asia, from Siberia to the Tibetan Plateau to the tropics of Southeast Asia. We know far more about Denisovans from their DNA than from their bones, and that DNA tells a remarkable story. In one especially striking discovery, researchers identified a bone fragment nicknamed Denny, the daughter of a Denisovan father and a Neanderthal mother. A direct first-generation hybrid between two different human species, frozen in a single bone fragment for tens of thousands of years. It's proof that these weren't separate worlds that never touched. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans were crossing paths and having children across an enormous stretch of Eurasia. Denisovan DNA didn't disappear either. It lives on today in the genomes of people across Oceania and Southeast Asia, including populations in Papua New Guinea, where some individuals carry several percent Denisovan ancestry, more than almost anywhere else on Earth. Some of that inherited DNA appears to have been useful. Certain Denisovan gene variants are linked to how some modern populations process fat and cold exposure, and a Denisovan-derived gene is believed to help Tibetan communities today live and breathe at extreme high altitudes where oxygen is scarce. So what happened to the Denisovans themselves? The honest answer is we don't fully know. Unlike the Neanderthals, we don't have enough fossils to reconstruct a clear timeline of their decline. What we do know is a pattern that rhymes with the Neanderthal story. A population that thrived for hundreds of thousands of years, encountered modern humans expanding across Asia, interbred with both us and the Neanderthals, and then quietly disappeared as a distinct population, leaving behind nothing but fragments and a genetic echo. They are, in the truest sense, a ghost species, proven to have existed almost entirely through molecules rather than bones. But if the Denisovans are a mystery of scarcity, our final case is a mystery of scale, because it involves the smallest humans who ever lived. In 2003, on the Indonesian island of Flores, archaeologists made a discovery that some called the most important human evolution find in a century. Buried in a cave called Liang Bua were the remains of an adult human standing barely 3.5 feet tall, with a brain roughly the size of a chimpanzee's, yet clearly capable of making sophisticated stone tools. Scientists gave it the formal name Homo floresiensis. Everyone else just called it the Hobbit. At first, researchers thought these hobbits might have survived until shockingly recently, as late as 12,000 years ago, which would have meant they overlapped with modern humans for tens of thousands of years on the very same island. But more careful excavation and dating work eventually revised that picture. Geologists went back and re-examined the layers of volcanic ash and mineral deposits above and below the fossils, and discovered an overlooked gap in the cave's sediment record that had thrown off the original dates. The hobbits, it turns out, disappeared much earlier, around 50,000 years ago, putting their extinction close to the same window as the Neanderthals, an ocean away. How did a population of tiny humans end up on a remote island in the first place? The leading theory is a phenomenon called island dwarfism. Ancestors of Homo erectus likely reached Flores over 500,000 years ago, and in an isolated environment with limited resources and no large predators, natural selection favored smaller bodies over many, many generations. It's the same evolutionary pressure that produced dwarf elephants on that same island, animals the hobbits apparently hunted using surprisingly sophisticated stone tools for their size. And that's where new research adds a haunting twist. A recent study reconstructing the ancient climate of Flores, using the chemistry of fossilized elephant teeth and cave mineral deposits as a kind of prehistoric weather record, found evidence of a severe extended drought beginning roughly 61,000 years ago. That drought appears to have devastated the population of pygmy elephants the hobbits depended on for food, forcing both predator and prey into a shrinking, more desperate range right around the time modern humans were pushing through Southeast Asia on their way to Australia. Put those two pressures together, a collapsing food supply and the sudden arrival of a more adaptable, more numerous human species, and you have a population with nowhere left to retreat. No Hobbit DNA has ever been found in modern humans, unlike the traces left by Neanderthals and Denisovans. If there was ever contact between our species, it left no genetic footprint we've found yet. When the hobbits vanished, they may have vanished completely, the only one of these three lineages to leave no trace of itself inside us. Look at these three stories side by side, and a pattern starts to emerge, and it's not the one you'd expect. None of these species vanished overnight. None were wiped out in a single dramatic event. Neanderthals faded out across thousands of years and multiple regions. Denisovans thinned out slowly across an entire continent. The Flores hobbits held on in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years before a combination of climate collapse and new competition finally closed the door. In every case, the timing lines up with the same event: the expansion of Homo sapiens out of Africa and across the world. We weren't necessarily faster or smarter or stronger than any of these species. Neanderthals had bigger brains by volume. Hobbits had thrived in isolation for far longer than our own species has existed. Denisovans survived and adapted across some of the harshest terrain on the planet. What we may have had instead was reach, bigger social networks, wider trade routes, the ability to bounce back from a local disaster because we weren't relying on just one small isolated population in one valley or on one island. And in the most literal sense possible, we didn't just outcompete some of these species, we absorbed them. Their genes are still here. Every time a Neanderthal-derived gene helps someone's immune system respond to a modern pathogen, or a Denisovan-derived gene helps a Tibetan community process oxygen at high altitude, that's not ancient history. That's an extinct human species, still quietly doing its job inside a living person, right now, today. We tend to tell the story of human evolution as a straight line: apes, cavemen, us. The truth is messier and far more interesting. For most of the time, modern humans have existed. We shared this planet with other kinds of people, sometimes competing with them, sometimes trading with them, and sometimes having children with them. We are not the only outcome evolution produced. We are simply the last one standing. And that raises an uncomfortable question of our own. Every one of these species survived for an enormous stretch of time before it didn't. The Neanderthals lasted over 300,000 years. The hobbits held on for perhaps 500,000 years on their island. Modern humans, in our current form, have only been around for a fraction of that. If deep time has taught us anything, it's that survival is never guaranteed just because a species has already lasted a long time. It's a streak, not a promise. There's one more detail worth sitting with. Scientists didn't figure any of this out through some single dramatic discovery. It came from decades of patient, unglamorous work, redating bone fragments with better lab techniques, sequencing DNA from samples too degraded to have been readable a generation ago, and cross-referencing ancient climate records against the layers of dirt in a handful of caves most people will never visit. Every one of these three stories has already been revised at least once as the evidence improved. and there's no reason to think we're finished. Somewhere out there in a museum drawer or an unexcavated cave floor, there may be a bone fragment waiting to rewrite the Denisovan story the way the finger bone did in 2008, or a new climate record waiting to add another layer to what really happened on Flores. That's part of what makes this such a compelling mystery. It isn't ancient history in the sense of being finished and settled. It's an active investigation, and the last chapter hasn't been written yet. So maybe the real question isn't why they disappeared, maybe it's this. 300,000 years is an almost unimaginable stretch of time to exist, and it wasn't enough to guarantee survival for any of them. We've been here, as the only human species on Earth, for a fraction of that time. We're not the ending of this story, we might just be the current chapter.